enjoy the day. Ladies, gentlemen, distinguished guests, good morning. Thank you for coming and welcome to the LSE China Development Forum 2013. My name is Liu Zeling and I'm the Chief Director for this year's forum. Against the backdrop of the recent leadership change in China, our theme, China in Transition, is particularly relevant and important. As it moves into a period of enormous complexity, China is currently confronted with a series of rising challenges, such as a slowing economy, a distorted market, stalled legal reform, rising social pressures, as well as escalating geopolitical tensions. Today, in this auditorium, we will assess China's current situations and discuss what future undertakings are required. With us today are 25 most distinguished speakers, all of whom are leading experts on China. We believe you will benefit immensely from today's discussions, and I sincerely hope that you will find this year's forum most inspiring and rewarding. Now, it's my pleasure to introduce to you the President of the China Development Society, Mr. Hao Feng. Welcome.
Thanks, Derlin. Dear Lord Wei, dear Professor Danny Kwa, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. My name is Henry Feng, the President of LSE China Development Society. Firstly, on behalf of our society, we would like to welcome you all to the LSE China Development Forum 2013. First of all, please allow me to give you a brief introduction of our society's background. China Development Society was founded in the year 2002 by a group of young talented Chinese who aim to promote China's development at LSE. After 11 years of organic growth, China Development Society has become one of the most influential and the biggest societies at the LSE campus, with more than 3,000 members, including current students, alumni, and professionals. In addition, we are in a really close collaboration with a multitude of sponsors. We can't achieve today's success without their huge financial support. Furthermore, we are in a collaboration with more than 15 media partners, and they help us promote our events on their social networks. Every year, we organize 3 large events. The first event is what will happen here today, LSE China Development Forum. This forum was firstly organized in year 2009 with an aim to provide a high standard platform for the speakers and the audiences to exchange their perspectives on China's development. After 4 years of growth, the forum has already become the largest student-run China-themed forum in Europe. In previous years, we have successfully invited speakers like Sir Howard Davis, former director of LSE, Professor Zhang Weiying, Professor Xu Xiaonian, Professor Chen Zhiwu, 3 of the top 10 economists in China. The engagement of those high-profile speakers hugely raised the profile and the publicity of LSE China Development Forum. Another event we organize on an annual basis is called Lse Outlook Trip. Every year, we invite more than 30 students studying in the UK, mainly from Oxford, Cambridge, LSE, to Beijing and Shanghai, to visit some large multinational and local corporations. By doing that, they can gain a deeper understanding of China. Another event we organize on a regular basis, mostly twice a month, is called Bridging Mind Symposium. We always invite some professors from LSE, Oxford, and Cambridge, or some successful businessmen to give our members an exclusive talk about China. By running this society, we could also be having some fantastic opportunities to network with worldwide leaders and celebrities. Mr. Kevin Rudd, former Australian Prime Minister, will join us this afternoon. Our forum cannot achieve this great success without the huge support from our co-organizer, collaborator, and our sponsors. Therefore, on behalf of LSE China Development Society, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to the following co-organizer, collaborators, and platinum sponsors. Firstly, we would like to thank our co-organizer of CDF 2013, LSE Asia Research Center. Secondly, we would like to thank our collaborators of this year's forum, the 48 Group Club, Confucius Institute for Business London, and China Next Foundation. Next, we would like to thank our platinum, gold, and silver sponsors. Our platinum sponsors include Prudential, Sura Pacific, Cathay Pacific. Our gold sponsors include HSBC, Investec Asset Management. Our silver sponsors include Kinglong Mobile, eFinancial Careers, and SLU. Thank you so much to give us huge financial support for CDF 2013. Next, we would like to thank our official simultaneous interpretation service provider, KL Communications Limited Company. KL Communication is the leading specialist in the UK in government and corporate communications in Chinese. Last but not the least, we would like to thank our supporting partners, Mother's Bridge of Love and Rochester PR Group. Next, on behalf of our society, I would like to express our sincere gratitude to our media partners. Thank you so much for reporting LSE China Development Forum 2013. Finally, we'll be really grateful if you can follow us on the following social networks, as we will post all corresponding news related to our society across all these social networks. And today, we've got a Weibo team over there reporting this year's forum to our followers. So now, that's all from me. Without further ado, let's welcome Professor Danny Kwa, Kuwait Professor of Economics and the International Department at LSE, to open the LSE China Development Forum 2013. Let's welcome Professor Kwa.
Thank you very much, Henry and Celine, for putting together such a wonderful event. It's my pleasure to be part of the welcoming team this morning. So welcome to our distinguished guests from near and far, to friends and colleagues here in London and already here at the LSE, where at the LSE China Development Forum once again, where the theme this year is China in Transition. It is right that we look ahead at the Chinese landscape, where for today, for most people, their minds, when we see the word transition, harks to the changes that must necessarily follow the 18th National People's Congress. But we can do so only from an understanding of what has already gone before, because only through that overview can those of us who are outsiders, like myself, appreciate the magnitude and the significance of the task that is ahead, that confronts China's policymakers. What are the outlines of what has already responded, of what has already transpired? Well, we know, not from any official or national state propaganda, but from IMF and World Bank figures and other international data sources, that in these last 30 years, China has lifted over 600 million people out of extreme poverty, accounting for more than 100% of the world's poverty reduction, that in the last 3 decades, China has basically single-handedly pulled the world's economic center of gravity 5,000 kilometers east from where it used to be for most of the 20th century along the transatlantic axis west of London, so that now the world center of gravity is east of Helsinki, east of Bucharest, east of Izmir, Turkey. It is now somewhere in the Persian Gulf, and it is imminently heading another 5,000 kilometers east towards the boundary between India and China. Most of us already are familiar with these long-run developments, but what we might not be so familiar with is the behavior of the world following the 2008 global financial crisis, a large economic event that must figure in the thinking of anyone who thinks about transition for China or any other economy in the years ahead. And here's the fact. In the last 4 years following the 2008 global financial crisis, China has added to the world's economy almost $5 trillion, 3 times that the United States has contributed. Even as the Chinese economy was supposed to grow only because it exported to the US economy. But clearly, in this time, China's growth could not have come from just US exports because the US was basically an economy flat on the floor. Now, in light of these developments, as we look ahead, well, I like to paraphrase what my friend Kishore Mahbubani, the dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy in Singapore, used to say. He used to remind us, economic development is just plain difficult. Economic development is small enough in small to medium-sized economies. But when you step back from figures like the one I've just talked about, and you realize that it has been China, the world's most populous economy, that at the same time is racking up, in the last 3 decades, the world's fastest growth rates. Well, it's a bit like seeing the fattest kid in school just win the 110-meter hurdles and the marathon. And we need to know that as we look forwards in the transition, that this is something that has already happened. There is no rewriting that will take away from China what is already done for the global economy. Looking forwards, we know imbalances pervade China's economy. Inequality is high, whatever the source of that inequality. Financial and banking systems are fragile. China desperately needs more transportation infrastructure. The government needs to invest in that, even as the rest of the world criticizes China for having already over-invested at the expense of consumption. Domestic social discontent is rampant in China, even if at the same time, many Chinese people have a national pride in their country that continues to grow. China's middle classes feel frustrated as their expectations on entitlement in social amenities and continued material improvement seem to them obstructed by petty government officials, by entrenched social interests, by hereditary extractive elites at the top of the socio-economic pyramid. Now, when you look across all of this, the single agreed upon solution to these problems, to sustain economic growth, to achieve political legitimacy, is of course reform. But reform of what kind? Following the 18th National Party Congress, but even before, reform is what many observers, both inside and outside China, constantly sift through evidence and political announcements to find. Many observers, not all of them, have in mind, when they think of reform, the words Western-style democratization and political legitimacy through ballot box election. Now, in that vision, such changes would in one fell swoop work through the socio-economic mechanism to correct China's domestic imbalances, to repair China's internal financial and banking fragile systems, and to reduce China's induced global imbalances in foreign trade and capital flows. In that vision, again, articulated by many, but not all, these changes would let China evade the looming middle income trap, which China now imminently faces, like perhaps Singapore did too in the mid-1990s. Observers in advanced Western economies, these same last 30 years, while they're mindful of changes that continue to develop, these profound changes in the global economy that have already occurred, perennially suggest China's imminent slowdown. One of these days, these naysayers will almost surely be right. But at the same time that they suggest China's rise cannot continue, many Western observers also fret that China's continued rise puts at risk Western jobs and dangerously destabilizes the global economy. That is why observers worldwide sit up and pay attention when newspaper headlines, even newspapers like, our own Financial Times, shrilly announce how in the United States, Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke says foreign investors fuel the global financial crisis. Or when Neil Ferguson writes in Vanity Fair and solemnly proclaims that in the run-up to the 2008 global financial crisis, China's savings glut was the underlying cause of the surge in bank lending and the hedge fund population explosion. So as China looks ahead on its own transition, international observers also see a transition for the world. And some international observers see the remedy for these problems to be the return of a credible global hegemon, so-called global hegemonic stability theory. There are some international observers who yearn for an earlier time in world history when the global hegemon, who's just turned out the lights, when the global hegemon, the United States, yielded enough economic power and international credibility to enforce global economic outcomes. Now, if the world does go back to that era, what will happen to China, an export-oriented China, when in Western democracies, rhetoric is already so high on trade protectionism? In closing this welcome speech, I want to warn us that at the same time that China continues along its path of transition, the focus of today's China Development Forum, we are also moving, I think, towards a paradox in global economic development. And that paradox takes the form of two concluding questions. Does political legitimacy and economic sustainability really obtain only with Western-style democracy? And second, whether or not that is the case, will continuing democratization of the world now paradoxically be blocked by the democratic publics of the West? If China fails, we will never find out the answer to either of these questions. I look forward to how today, in the discussions that we will have, we will come closer to such an understanding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Kwa, for your brilliant welcome speech. So without further ado, now let's move to our first program, China in Transition. During this session, each speaker will deliver a 10-minute presentation to share with us his insights into this topic. And unfortunately, as we have just learned yesterday, Dr. Gerald Leoms won't be attending this session because of a time conflict. On behalf of the organizing committee, I offer my most sincere apologies. So now, let's welcome our first speaker, Lord Wei, onto the stage. Lord Wei, let's welcome.
Well, it's a real honor to be here with you today, and I think the theme of this conference is indeed extremely timely. China is indeed in transition. And we have all heard over the last few years about China's meteoric growth and rise, as well as the many social and environmental challenges that come with its vast urbanization, increasing consumption and industrialization. And indeed, just as we've been hearing in the last few weeks, with the many changes that have come since the Congress, of the need to challenge corruption, of smog in cities like Beijing and other cities getting to extreme levels, and the role of social media within Chinese society, one might be tempted to think that this period of transition and the challenges that accompany it are unique, that China is a uniquely challenged country, a country with a transition and difficulties that are distinctly Chinese, that have Chinese characteristics. But of course, we've been here before in many respects. Britain, even up until the 1960s, so I'm told, was a country that had to deal with many familiar challenges that we are now having increasingly to discuss. If you would have walked out of the door on a day like today, in the 1960s even, the smog would be so thick that it was reported in London that people would regularly die because they'd fall down holes in the ground, manholes, because they couldn't actually see their hands in front of them. In the 1960s. And it's so easy for us to forget, in the West in particular, as we look at China and the challenges that China and other emerging countries face with their growth and transformation, that actually many Western countries have had to face similar transitions before. I'm a particular student of the Victorian era, and I observe many, many similarities between the Industrial Revolution of the mid-Victorian era and the challenges that we see today in a country like China. Huge urbanization, cities like Manchester and Birmingham literally sprouting overnight. And of course the alienation that comes with that, the isolation, as communities once rural suddenly had to develop in industrial environments. And yet also was a time of increasing consumption and of vast wealth, and then the instability that came with that, as rich lived next to extreme poverty. Britain in this era, the early 1900s, was a country of huge inequality, of state-led capitalism. Cities like Hong Kong, for example, were effectively government-led forms of companies. And of course there was corruption too, exemplified, if I may, by the fact that many seats in the House of Commons were purchased for a fee, quite openly. And the British elite at the time were indeed fearful of continental-style revolution. But they had something which I think also the Chinese have. Now, the British of that era in particular were very pragmatic. Their philosophy, their intellectual heritage was not one of abstract principles, which we saw in, say, Europe, leading to written constitutions, universal principles of human rights, and so on. No, the British, in the tradition of Burke and others before him, indeed Adam Smith himself with the economy of regard, were very conscious of the role of relationships and how, yes, the capitalism that powered the Industrial Revolution could generate huge wealth, but that was not something that you could then lead you to ignore responsibility and ignore the human cost around you. And indeed, that sense of pragmatic self-interest, coupled with the new wealth generated by industrialization in Britain, coupled with the capacity, new capacity of people, particularly women in British society, I think provided some of the ingredients for reform and a way out, which I'm going to talk about a little later in my speech. Of course, the Chinese situation today is different in many ways, happening in an era of digital and physical technology and their transforming power, in an era of globalization where everyone is connected and things move at light speed. And of course, China has its own particular history, stretching back 5,000 years. And we're all doing this in a period of global austerity and uncertainty post-2008. But what is interesting in all of this to me, whether you look at Western history and specifically British society and economies as they transitioned, is whether we will see some similar transitions happening within China that we saw in that era. Britain and many countries having come to the end of the initial high-growth period of industrialization, suddenly having to engage on a most difficult period of institution building and of finding ways to deal with the challenges that that growth and that wealth had created. I think some of the ingredients that were there in the mid-Victorian era are also there in China. I'm less pessimistic than some Western commentators are. For example, we talk a lot about the rise of social media, which is incredibly important. I don't know if you know, but there was a similar technology back in the Victorian era. It was called the cheap printing press. For the first time in history, people could very cheaply print leaflets. And it led to a proliferation of thousands and thousands and hundreds of societies, of groups, of conversations that were very difficult for any authority in British and Western society to control. Could social media in China and new technology create forms of peer governance that are actually superior over time to Western legal systems, which move at quite a slow pace? My aide is a lawyer, and I can tell you that sometimes the legal system here in Britain is not as efficient as it could be. Wikipedia highlights a way in which, without a formal legal system, you can create new ways of governance which harness the light speed technologies that we have at our disposal. And we're seeing, I think, slowly the emergence of a business class within and around China that is starting to recognize its responsibilities and the need to preserve its reputation through ethical and responsible and sustainable behavior. There was a group of business people in Britain, the Quakers, people who invented John Lewis and Cadbury and Unilever and many of the well-known British brands. I suspect many of the global successful Chinese brands will have to be leaders in this field in order to succeed. The global challenge today is not necessarily fair wages and government providing benefits. These are all important, but sadly these are all subject to global pressures, globalization. The issue today is we don't share wealth in our businesses. Young people need to have equity in companies and not just benefits and housing, because wealth rises faster than the average support or wages can maintain or keep up. And there do seem to be, among policymakers behind the scenes in and around China, a willingness to at least talk about what needs to happen and finding ways to consult people, paralleling some of the changes that took place in Britain's history, which I would encourage you to study. Much is made of the changes that happened in British history in Parliament, but I also think that competition between cities was very important. Adam Smith himself said that one way to tackle corruption is for cities to develop through their own wealth means to buy their own freedom and their own governance. If one city is corrupt, then a businessman can go to another city and find a city in which they can do business without having to pay bribes. And if more cities adopt that, if we can have competition within countries like China for cities that are literally cleaner and better places to do business, like the city of London perhaps used to be, arguably still is, but certainly before, where your word was your bond, then I think we can see a way out of the current challenges. All of these are encouraging, and it would be interesting to see how the coming years, the leadership in China and those in generally in society there, embrace this transition process, but go through it, similar to the last few decades, in a matter of perhaps 20, 30 years, and having to create the institutions and change which it took a country like Britain over 100, maybe 200 years to create. But in closing, in my view, there is also a role too, not just for those within China, but also for global diaspora, of which most of you in this room are an example. I've said this previously here at LSE before, but a China in transition is also one that people around the world want to learn more about and encounter. And often we, the diaspora, who live and work and study outside of China, end up being the visible representatives of what is happening to those around the world. So we therefore have an opportunity, as China continues to rise and changes, to help harness the resources, the energy, the excitement around these huge transitions to improve the world socially, economically, and culturally. We mustn't just focus on the challenge that is to do with China internally. I think other countries did that, like Japan, and they lost out as a result. A China that is global and that thinks globally will ultimately be a China that succeeds domestically as well, taking the ideas and the thinking that we see around us, combining it with the best of Chinese culture and values, commerce and entrepreneurship, wisdom and history, to make a difference both internally and externally at a time when globally there seems to be so few answers. It's time for us Chinese and those who love China to be the change we want to see in the world and create an inclusive, sustainable, productive Chinese dream that creates jobs, support and solutions for all. That's why over the last year, my team and I have been working on developing a diaspora leadership program, which we've just launched, called the Emerging Leaders Initiative, which you can find out more about at diasporagroup.org.uk. Finding ways to train the next generation of leaders in how to understand social policy, social enterprise, how Western systems work, and then getting them the very best mentors in Western society. If you want to be a banker, the very best banker. If you want to be an advertising exec, a TV producer, finding people to help them to make it in the West so that they can learn about how the elite in the West understand their problems, and seeing if that then can lead to learning that can be shared and harnessed within China, and then for China in its relationship with the world. By learning practically how we address the challenges we face here in the UK within the Chinese community, in the UK-China relationship, and then ultimately in applying some lessons learned in China, we can generate the kinds of leaders that we're going to need in this next transitional era. Business leaders who share wealth and who create solutions for society and not just for themselves. Government leaders who harness the power of social media and technology to create new forms of governance and who don't just just adopt the Western ones and bring them back into China. And social entrepreneurs who create solutions that don't just help one group of people, but entire cities at a time, and replicate across cities. That is what the Victorians did, creating entire cities, chains of schools, chains of hospitals, entire social media movements to tackle alcoholism and corruption and all kinds of things. Those are the kinds of leaders that we need today in China. Frankly, those are still the kind of leaders we need today in the world. So I hope that many of you will get involved either as participants in Diaspora group and in the projects that will come out of this, or more generally in your lives here in London and as you go back. Yes, strive to be an economist, a banker, a government official, but also consider what change you could produce by being a social entrepreneur, by being someone that uses the power of the internet to change the conversation, by being ultimately a business person that takes a huge business and uses all of its resources to create a new settlement. I began this talk with a reference to British history. In the end, Britain built an empire by harnessing smart, highly educated people at universities such as this. China is more modest in her goals. I'm pretty certain she doesn't want to build an empire. But with Britain and the West also in transition, perhaps we can harness smart, well-educated diaspora, Chinese and others, such as yourselves, living and studying the West, to help create the conditions and the connections between the institutions, cities, and people around the world that are now needed to create, in turn, the solutions that produce the jobs, prosperity, and health that we're going to need in the 21st century. This is going to be a century in which China, and I believe the Chinese, can positively play their part as an emerging, transitioning influence in the world today. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Wei, for your most inspiring speech. Now let's welcome our second speaker, Mr. Stephen Perry, Chairman of the 48 Group Club, onto the stage. Stephen, please. Let's welcome.
Danny, Nat, ladies and gentlemen, I was just sitting there thinking I'm the last speaker. I'm going to read my speech and prepare myself. And suddenly I heard my name being announced, and here I am. So if I look a bit flustered, it's because I'm not ready for you. I hope I read the speech you've got. And I hope it all works okay. It's a fascinating opportunity to be back here in the LSE. I was here about 45 years ago as a radical student leader protesting against the American war in Vietnam. And I would love to be your age again. Anyway, now I have to read a bit. The association of the LSE and the 48 Group goes back over 20 years, when my father used to participate in a forum under another name. It is a fitting project for Chinese students to engage in, to deepen understanding of China among Chinese living in the UK and British people interested in China. The LSE is a major British educational institution whose events have an impact in the UK. This forum has already developed a reputation for serious study of China, and I am sure after today, more people will await next year's forum with anticipation. The 48 Group goes back 60 years. This is the 60th anniversary of the first icebreaker mission to China, which my father was one of the leaders of, which opened up Western trade with the People's Republic of China. And I today am the chairman of the 48 Group Club, but what I express today are my personal opinions, not the opinions necessarily of the club. Your subject matter is appropriate, China in transition. I would say that in all of my 45 years of working with China, every morning I've woken up and thought about China, I've thought that China is in transition. But China is in a unique transition at the moment, and the choice of words are particularly apt at this time. And you have a series of speakers today who address the subject from many vantage points. I'm coming at it somewhat similarly to Nat. The British Industrial Revolution was the first. Well, you could say there was an industrial revolution in China about 2,000 years ago, or 3,000 years ago, but in terms of modern industrial revolution, the British was probably the first, the longest, and arguably the most impactful on the world. And ours is a good experience to study as China is now going through its industrial revolution. Ours perhaps lasted, change of script, for 150 years. I took off 100 years. Ours perhaps lasted for 150 years. China's will last about 50 to 60 years. Our outcome, or finish of our industrial revolution, was around about 120 years ago, when the world was a very different place. Our value system, ours, the Bible, China's Confucius, Buddhism, Taoism, and Marxism, are very different. And our economic starting points, ours feudal into private capitalism, yours feudal into state-managed corporations, are very different. But let us not hide the fact that disparity in wealth was exceedingly great during our industrial revolution. You can want equality, as I do, as Nat does, and a better sharing of wealth. But economic development tends to feature a period of disparity. And trying to bring equality in disrupts progress if it's pursued merely as an ideal and not related to the needs for growth. Our social and political reforms were achieved as a result of struggle because those in power, the owners of business in general, did not want to change. But in the end, we developed a system for compromise between workers and power that resulted in our parliamentary democracy and welfare state. These changes tended to follow economic development, and ideals of advance were insufficient motivation on their own. Our changes in society were from within and not the result of others trying to tell us how to be. So China in transition will largely learn from our experience, perhaps, and will sensibly anticipate crises and changes before the pressures get to breaking point. So serious moves to stop corruption, not merely punish it. There you go, I mentioned corruption and the lights go out. So serious, I'd rather do a TV show. So serious, not very good on this China subject. Anyway, so serious moves to stop corruption, not merely punish it, will have to become the order of the day. The rights of people to protest and influence planning decisions, the first aspect of the British rule of law, that's really where the British rule of law started from, about planning decisions, will be innovated in China because the people want it, need it, and the government will respond to that, in my opinion. Parliamentary democracy, which Nat talked about, is not a part of Chinese traditions, and China's democracy will develop in relation to China's own civilization